Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. If you do have that alcoholic beverage, I'm not going to judge you, but don't worry, I won't be sleeping at the wheel. Julia, my guest, might have a little taste of something over here on non-alcoholic or no, I don't know. But anyways, I should probably introduce this show. Welcome everyone to the Architecture Social, and we're going to go deep and talk about, is this for me? What do I mean by that? 10 tips that Julia here has on finding your fit in studio culture. Because I always think that when you're going for a job, you're always thinking about impressing that company. You're worried about what they're going to think about you. However, we're going to talk about, is it right for you? And going through that search. And this was Julia's amazing idea. So Julia Nicholls, welcome to the stage. How are you?
I am good, thank you. Thank you very much.
Virtual round of applause.
I'm really good, thank you. I think it's a really important thing to discuss, that, an interview is a two-way thing. You should be finding the right fit for you. They should be finding the right fit for them. So I guess today is about helping people work out how to find their fit.
Yeah, I think you're right. And to help people find their fit, Julia, I know what you've done in industry, but for those who might not know you yet, can you tell everyone about all the wonderful things you've done in the industry?
Okay. So I am a communications strategist. I've worked with architects for over 20 years, helping them to kind of communicate with their clients, with the wider industry, with their community around them. And really just, working with startups to really establish studios. I think communications has to be really authentic to each practice and backed up with evidence and activity. There's no point in having really great messaging if you're not actually doing that work as well. And for those 20 plus years have mostly been in practice. I've only been a consultant for 2 years. So I've been a part of, a culture or several cultures and sort of been on that journey. I've experienced the sort of culture and the social life from being a graduate and a sort of young employee hungry to make a good impression.
Yeah.
I've then become a parent. I've now, I guess what you term midlife. It's just a bit before you get old. And I've sort of experienced from all levels of management. I left my last practice as a director, so I've been sort of like a participant, and I've also been kind of responsible for creating and sort of nurturing culture. Nice. And now as a consultant, I guess I get to speak to a lot of practices about what they do to sort of create a culture or not. So.
Brilliant. I think that's super cool and helpful for this topic, to be someone that's done the job, but also someone who, you've got to that management level, because you can see both sides of the coin. I think when you're on one side, you think, oh, we should be doing this and that. But when you've actually been a manager as well, sometimes, certain things come to light that you think, oh, wow, definitely. Okay, there's a reason why that didn't happen.
And I think how your experience of culture kind of changes according to the position you're in your kind of career, but also in your life. Different bits will be more important than others at different life stages. And I think very much people create a culture. Like a company has to invest in setting a framework, making time and resource available to kind of create a culture. But then it's the culture plus the employees that kind of have an active role in making that culture come alive. And for me, that's where it's absolutely essential that a company needs to listen to and understand the people in their organization to know that they're going to create a culture that people are going to want to engage in. You've got to know your people and know your audience. It shouldn't feel like something that's imposed on you by a single person's kind of, want of what a culture should be. It really needs to be felt by the whole company and the team.
Very cool. Now, I was just thinking while you're here, because you've sent me this awesome list that you've curated. So we've distilled all those years of knowledge down. So I'm going to bring up number 1, actually. So I'm just typing away. I promise, Julia, I'm not distracted. I'm in the room. I was just doing it as we go. And number one that you put down on these 10 tips for finding your fit within studio cultures was values and purpose. Now, that could mean a few different things in different contexts to different people, but what's your understanding of value and purpose?
Yeah, so I mean, to start off with, I think purpose and values, as well as culture, for me is the starting point of every communication strategy I work on. I couldn't create a strategy without knowing all of those three things. For me, values and purpose is the why of a company. It's the reason that they set up practice. It's the driving force behind the work that they do. It's not just a manifesto that sits as text on a website page. It's something that is deeply felt and is consistently evidence in action. So some practices are very clear about their purpose and values. It's basically about being clear about what you do, but more importantly, why you do it. So if I'm thinking about building sustainably with, like, you know, timber and hybrid structures, one of the first practices that comes to mind is Wall Thistleton. And if you look at Wall Thistleton, you'll see that they are consistently talking about why it's so important, what the benefits are. If I'm thinking about practices that might improve the quality of social housing, I'm thinking immediately of people like Bell Phillips, Pitman Tozer, Archeo, those practices that are always talking about their why. So sometimes it's easy to find values and purpose, sometimes it's not. You can look for things like what kind of clients are they working for, and organizations. You know, are those clients and organizations that you want to be working for? Are there any kind of ethical issues there in terms of regimes or organizations that you don't think fit with, you know, who you would be comfortable working with? And also that applies to projects. So, you know, would you be comfortable working on an airport, for example, in a sort of, you know, climate crisis? One of the high-profile projects at the moment is the NEOM project in Saudi Arabia. You know, that's picking up a lot of stick of people calling it an ecological and moral atrocity. But for others, it's a real innovative challenge in engineering and in architecture. So, you know, just thinking, would you be comfortable in that scenario? Thinking about the accessibility and the affordability of the architecture being created there. So yeah, those are the kind of things I would be thinking about in terms of values and purpose. Where does that practice sit in the sort of industry, and what do they really believe in?
Very interesting. And also, just to add to that as well, is probably this list, a lot of it as well. It can go a two-way thing. Like, I think values and purpose is a good middle ground, perhaps in an interview to talk about. And I think it really helps the architecture practice know that you've considered the company seriously. If you've read those values and purposes, and maybe there's some common ground, then that can kind of break the ice a little bit. I mean, have you seen examples of that when you've been the hiring manager for your team? Is that something you've looked for yourself?
Yeah, I think definitely, because I think that, like, having shared purpose and values is a real motivator.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think someone's way more likely to stay in the job and see their career in that company if they really have aligned values. So definitely for me, that would be a kind of tick in the box if you know, there was evidence on both the people and the practices side of a shared purpose.
Nice. I think that makes complete sense. Do you know what? I'm going to put in number 2 here. I should have done this before, but we'll do it live anyways. It's no problem. Ways of working.
Yeah.
Now, that's really interesting. How would one find ways of working? Is it asking in the interview, or
There's a few strands to this. There's some kind of like top level ones, like what's the business structure? Is it an employee ownership trust, a partnership? You know, who are the shareholders? That kind of a very sort of top section. Then there's like a leadership. You know, is it traditionally hierarchical? Is it more collegiate? Is it a practice that needs to be thinking about succession, bearing in mind that succession takes sort of 5+ years?
Yeah.
You know, it's a perfectly reasonable question to ask if you think it applies to that practice. Also, the management of projects. So how are different aspects of architecture managed in that practice? Do they have a kind of front-end concept team and then a different team for delivery? You know, is that how you want to work, or do you want to see a project through right from the start to the finish? how do they value the sort of design process? Are they more sort of on commercial programs where that, you know, delivery comes really quickly, or do they make time for experimentation? And, you know, is that something that you want to be doing in practice? Does their process involve community engagement or working with young people? Those are the kind of things that if they're fundamental to you, you'd want to see they're fundamental to the practice you're working for. And then I think management of people is another side of that. Obviously, ways of working being, you know, what does your ideal working week look like? Is it full-time, part-time, flexible, hybrid, all in the studio? And again, I think at different life stages, you might want to do more or less time in the studio. So, you know, and this is a real kind of hot topic in the industry at the moment, because there are practices that will not evolve at all to allow any kind of hybrid working. And there are others that have almost gone completely the other way. And it's not to say there's a right way or wrong way, but you've got to find your fit. So yeah, I think those would be the aspects of ways of working I'd be thinking about.
Very cool. And it was interesting as you expanded on the answer. You're right. There's, you know, what RIPA stage is, there's the kind of approach to designing, but then as you said, it's the logistics, isn't it? It's like, how does one go about it? Like JTP is very community driven. The teams are all built around that. But then also, you know, on the other end, it's like, what's the actual job going to like? What are the hours? You will laugh. Today was because I've hired someone. We were talking a little bit about it before, Julia. Woo, you know, the architecture social is expanding, but it was our first day working remotely, and so our ways of working are in development, right? But rather than thinking, do you know what? Everything wasn't perfect today. No, we're not going to go back in the office. It was like, well, actually, we've got to learn how to get better in that way of work. I mean, and a quick one, maybe before we move on, before I get the next point up. Well, it actually ties in nicely with this. What I was going to say, you've got point number 3 actually is studio. And studio in 2023, I mean, there'll always be an office. There will always be a culture.
It's
Studio,
true.
it's physical, and now it's slightly metaphysical on teams and this and that and so forth. But what's you mentioned in terms of the top 10 tips to look for in the right fit. Why is studio so important?
I think particularly when you're looking at studio culture, the feel that you get from a studio environment really says a lot, and how you can evidence, like, you know, who's working there. Does it seem accessible and friendly? Do people seem happy? You know, do you think you'd be able to work kind of you know, collaboratively in that environment? This is obviously going to be different depending on how often people are in the studio, or is it in a kind of WeWork type of space where it's more difficult to sort of, you know, create your own environment. But I guess, you know, firstly, I'd be thinking about location. So, you know, does it suit you that, you know, there's now a sort of growing trend for actually architects to be based more in like neighborhoods, you know, even suburban neighborhoods, you know, rather than all in bunched together in Clerkenwell or whatever. You know, how does that work with you? You know, someone's awkward neighborhood to get to is actually somebody else's total dream location. So thinking about, will you take public transport, cycle to walk? How will that impact your experience of working there? If you are going to be cycling there, do they have showers and changing and storage? Also, do they have space for, you know, a kitchen to prepare food or just heat up some food? Is there communal dining? So that kind of environment, does it feel welcoming? Does it feel like somewhere that you could just be comfortable being you know, talk about this sort of bringing your authentic self to work. Do you feel like you could be yourself in that space? And also, like, something I think would be really important is, can you see spaces to do focused work, but also collaborative work, or be social? Because, you know, you no longer need to come to an office just to sit at a desk all day. That's, you know, we can do that at home. So you're actually going to the studio for other reasons. Does the environment support you doing those other activities, social and collaborative? So I guess that those are the kind of physical studio things, assuming that there is a physical studio, which I think, to be honest, like, in my opinion, I feel it's a shame not to have any kind of studio at all. I think culture, you know, it sort of comes from being together. So I'm in this context, I'm assuming there is some kind of studio.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I've been making these decisions very recently, and I kind of went from, well, we can do a bunch of it remote, and then now I'm going into the office, and I agree with you. There is something nice about being together. You got the camaraderie. There's something nice about being in a space where you can, like, tangibly touch stuff and be close with one another. At the same time, though, I think, like you said, studio environment,
Yeah,
flexibility is a key, and I think employers have to embrace flexibility. It's not going away. And
yeah,
I probably think, like, maybe the old guard and stuff are trying to get people back in the office 4 to 5 days a week. They probably lose out a lot of people
yeah.
because
They
go on.
do. Yeah, no, I mean,
Mm,
I completely agree. I think if you're not going to evolve, you're going to, slice off a huge amount of potential employees who, are, there's a lot of talent there that you're just counting out.
yeah.
And I definitely feel that, a studio is important, but I also strongly feel you don't need to be there all the time. I think
Yeah.
that's a management issue of when do people need to be in and when do they not need to be in.
Yeah, I agree. And before we moved on to the next point, I'm glad you touched upon something. You're a proud mother, you have a family. And my experience before, Julia, is that I would meet really amazing architects, or even people at different points in their career where they got to look after someone, or they've just had their firstborn child or whatever. And yeah, kind of, it's a bit of a strange situation before, because it was like, oh, you have to be in the office by 9 because everyone else is. So basically people's careers were kind of put on hold, and
Yeah.
which is a shame. Whereas now I think people are starting to realize, well, hang on, if we start doing things remote and flexi, then you can make something work for everyone. Have you seen a
Definitely.
big change on that side?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to have seen more of a change,
Yeah,
but it's definitely changing, and I think the younger practices, it's just a given.
yeah,
I also think very strongly that you don't need to, start a family to want some flexibility. That you have other things going on in your life that are important to you. So obviously, starting a family is a really big moment, but there are other big moments and big priorities that you could have in your life that just mean you want some flexibility. So yeah, I think it's really important.
yeah, well said. And well, I've got the next tip coming up. I was just going to say that we've got one or two little comments coming in from the
Ooh.
lovely audience. Those who are on LinkedIn at this time of night, I applaud you. Lovely to see you, AO, who says, totally agree. Have to admit, I'm going to start in a co working space now, and then to mix things up and to see people more. Well, I tell you what, if you're in WeWork Waterloo, come join me. So loads of pool tables and stuff. And that's where I am at the moment. Although that might distract you because I am quite loud and Welsh, but somehow in that WeWork, it's so loud that you don't hear me, which is amazing. Normally it's the other way around, and I was distracting people in the studio and causing loud internal communication. That's probably not what you meant though when you put this point. I'm dying to know why you thought number 4, internal communication, was a good tip that people should look out for, or
I
keep in
mean,
mind.
I think you could probably do a whole episode on internal communications, but I've whittled it down. In fact, you shared a stats earlier this month, Stephen, about
Cool.
transparency. You said 96% of job seekers say transparency is really important to them.
True. Yeah.
And I think I completely agree. It's really, really important. It's also, I think, worth saying, a fairly new or sort of recent management consideration. I think if you were managing 10, 20 years ago, no one expected transparency. And so it's almost something that has to be learned of, like, what are the boundaries to transparency? But I do
Mm,
think there's a real benefit to bringing people on the journey with you of running a business, of winning new work, of taking the practice forward. I think with all the employee ownership trusts and all this kind of thing, people want to feel invested, and if they don't, they're going to be more likely to move off and try and find that somewhere else. So I think transparency is really important. So things like open forums. This is something to think about if you're in a studio at the moment as well, not
Nice.
necessarily looking for work, and thinking how could we do this better? You know, architecture is such a slow game. You could be on a project for years without sort of working on anything else. So it's really nice to know what else is happening in the business that might be quite exciting, that, you know, could be the next thing you work on. So what are kind of project wins or, you know, competitions that are happening? What's the strategy for kind of, you know, the business moving forward, or communications or succession, as we spoke about earlier, all these things that people might actually be interested in outside of their particular project. And then transparency in terms of sort of coming back to values and things, but, you know, are there focus groups for perhaps skills and training that people might need? This often needs to be fed from the bottom to the top in terms of where things are moving and what they might need upskilling in. You know, are there sort of diversity and inclusion focus groups, or like a social focus group that kind of, you know, bring that side of the culture forward? That's the sort of internal communication that I was thinking about in terms of if you're in practice or you're looking at a practice.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I like what you said. These tips could be used to improve cultures, but also maybe they're things that you haven't thought about. And maybe it could set off some alarm bells or things you should think about. Because sometimes when you get in an environment, you're taking it for a given. You know, I remember when I went into a new office and I'm like, really? Is this person saying that? That's just, and then you go, oh, that's just what they like. And
I know, yeah, you get sort of, I totally agree. Oh, it's just the way it is here. And you think, well, you know, there should be an openness to, you know, from management to listen to younger people, because the people who won't listen to younger people won't evolve. And we know what happens to those companies.
Yeah, 100%. I think it makes complete sense. And also now, I'd say the last point on that before we move on to a big one, number 5 is pretty big. I'll keep everyone in suspense. But internal communication, though, is it's also not just about what's said, it's all the vehicles, isn't it? And it gets confusing now with Teams, and you got Slack and Zoom and WhatsApp groups. So it can get pretty messy. So when I'm trying to work out the right kind of balance as well. But
it's a really good point. Yeah, I mean, I think you could do a whole show on it. How sort of, you know, how to sort of streamline it a little bit more so that people feel involved, but not like overwhelmed with information.
Yeah, and you also want like a place to blow off steam, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that's quite important. How do you emulate that kind of kitchen coffee shop nonsense that one or two people talk to each other online? It can be quite a tricky one. Because definitely today on my first working from home experiment, well, I still think it was really good and it's quite nice. Maybe it's peaceful to do certain things. I did miss the fun, the banter, you know what I mean? So there's only so much a GIF can replace, you know, rather than people. I will move on to the next point now, which is like, hey, 70-80% of the content on the Architecture Social. So good luck summarizing it very quickly. But I agree, it's really important. Career progression.
Really important. So, there's so many things we could say here. I'm going to start with, are there regular structured performance reviews? Remember, again, these are a two-way process. Any decent employer is going to want to know how you're doing and feed that back, but also how they are doing. How's your experience? And in terms of like setting goals and following up on those goals, you know, there should be notes written that you can come back to. I'm a really big champion of those really structured and recorded reviews, because things can easily get forgotten. And I think it really does help motivate. If you're still qualifying, what kind of support is there, informal or formal? So kind of part 3 peer groups, which may be led by somebody in practice, or actually it could just be a peer group, you know, just supporting each other in that way. Do they engage with apprenticeship schemes? Is there any mentoring or reviews? Again, just informally, that if you're doing your part 3 and you just want to run through with someone, is there somebody there assigned, or just somebody, you know, friendly that you can talk to get a bit of a steer? how do they invest in sort of upskilling people when, you know, new software technology, are they willing to send people on training courses or to get somebody in to do like a bulk training? And also management training. I think this is really important, and it may not be for you yet, but your managers who maybe have been an architect and they've suddenly been promoted to a sort of people management role, are those people being trained to manage people? Because I think you'll find most often they won't, and they really should be, because that's a completely different skill set. That's not what you learn at architecture school. But if you're in charge of managing people, I think that you really should be trained in some way. And there are programs, there's one called the Step Up program, which is really coaching people into managing people when you're actually a creative yourself. If they don't do that, it's going to lead to very poor support for their staff and possibly a really poor experience. And the other thing I think is I've seen this be a problem in other practices where, you know, is the practice open to you being somebody perhaps outside of management, attending industry events or taking opportunities? So, you know, there's a lot of next gen networking opportunities. Would your firm be happy to, you know, pay for your tickets to go to those events? If you said, look, I've been asked to join a design review panel, or I've applied and got accepted, would they be happy to let you do that in work time? Because it is actually beneficial to you and the practice. If you're invited to crit or do a kind of occasional teaching role, how supportive is your practice of that? Those are the kind of things that I think, you know, if they're important to you, if being like staying part of academia is important to you, those are the kind of things that I think you should be thinking about with career progression.
Yeah, exactly. And I think if you ask to go to an event or on a topic which could help improve yourself and by effect of that improve the company, and the company says no, or kind of huffs and puffs or complains that you're not, you know, you're interfering, if that's a pattern of things that are going on, you're right, it's probably not a progressive environment, which is really
Yeah,
short term. Because I'm always amazed, like the employer will always get something out of it. And if, for instance, like London Build Expo, I popped out there last year and it's like, oh, I'm a bit tired. Should I do it? Will it be good for me? Will it be good for the business? I'm not too sure. But you know, when you go to these things, you make so much connections, you learn so much. And like you said, that maybe being involved in the Grasshopper group or the BIM London circuit, you're
yeah,
going to learn really cool stuff. It's going to make so much network. And it's great for the company, outward facing person. Isn't it great when your employees are knocking around, meeting people and talking about how good the company is? So there's
definitely. Yeah.
loads, there's loads of benefits, I think. You know, what's
Yeah,
wrong?
definitely. I think it's a win-win, but I've definitely seen practice be like, no, you need to be at your desk, you know, working on this project. And I agree with you, it's really short-sighted.
Yeah, and the last thing I'd add to that before we move on is that career progression doesn't necessarily need to be expensive in
Mhm.
that sense. You know, it can be everything from a LinkedIn course all the way up to, yes, okay, proper career progression. But actually, a lot of it is even simple stuff like taking the junior staff members to a site visit. They're going to learn a lot. They love it. You're going to go there
Definitely.
anyways. And it's those little things like that that really keep people being excited. If they've been behind the computer for a while, going on site and kind of going there with someone you look up to can be a total thrill. And, you know, okay, take a camera and send them to the marketing department. Win, win,
Exactly,
win.
yeah. I think it's thinking about their journey, you know, making sure everyone's having a good journey in your company, and then they're more likely to, you know, want to stay and continue there.
Yeah, I think so. Okay, now this is I'm super impressed by this. This is all Julia's work, everyone. I'm just that I look like I've written all these and I'm organized, but this is all Julia. So the next point that you've put down, which is really important, is inclusion.
Yeah.
Now, I find that people struggle to unpack this, or sometimes it's such an overwhelming topic that people shy away with it. What's your experience on inclusion then, Julian?
So, I mean, for me, I think that, you know, it can be a topic that, as you say, feels too big to some practices. They're sort of like, look, we try and, put words in our adverts that we hope will attract diverse candidates, and then it just doesn't happen, and da da da. But for me, first thing I'd be looking for in a company is representation. So, are there Black and Asian architects? Are there women in management positions? Anyone with a disability work there? And across the studio, from junior staff to management, I'd be looking for representation. That's your first sort of step.
Yeah.
If this seems like a practice who is finding representation a challenge, then I would definitely want to know what they're doing about it. Firstly, there's training programs, and there's a lot of consultancies and workshops available on kind of equity, diversity and inclusive culture change. So there's nothing stopping anyone from learning what they could be doing more of to increase representation in their firm, but also in the industry, and also challenging themselves to think about, is the environment we have here welcoming to everybody? Is it an inclusive environment and culture? So there's nothing stopping anyone doing that. And then I think, again, do they engage with any initiatives that encourage diversity in the industry? Again, of which there are so many that you could literally just plug into. So no one's saying you have to set up your own, program. You could do Open City Accelerate, RIBA Future Architects, Building Futures, Reset Go. You could, if you felt like, okay, look, we don't have the time, you could just give to a bursary like the Neighbourhood Scholarship Fund. So there's really nothing stopping you from doing your bit to increase representation in the industry. So those are definitely questions that I would be asking in an interview. If I couldn't see representation, then I would be asking sort of, what are they doing?
Yeah, makes sense. This list, I think, is also quite poignant time for me, who's trying to build up my team. So thank you for this. It's like getting a coaching session myself. It's just, I can't see any downside of why you wouldn't be inclusive. But it's absolutely maddening, Julia, that we still have to put it here, because there is such a long way to go still, isn't it? And I'm like you, I go look on some websites and you've got some amazing ones, and there's some great companies who are really inclusive and talk about going that way. And then there's the old school, there's a running joke, isn't it, of like 10, 50-year-old, gray-haired white blokes. And okay, but you got to mix it up a bit. As you said, you want different perspectives. You want a balance. It's very important to me. I wouldn't want a bunch of men, because that's just one direction that the company's going in. Right? We have to be inclusive, and also, times are changing. I'm hopeful as well. I'm starting to see different people going into architecture. It isn't such a middle class perceived profession. There's nothing wrong with being middle class. What I mean is, it's really opening up now, isn't it? And I think that as well, employers need to appeal to everyone, because, it's 2023. Do I really want to work in a non-inclusive environment? Probably not.
And again, like a bit like they're not offering flexibility in terms of working, these firms are missing out on a whole tranche of talent coming through the system, who are going to look at their website and their, like you say, lineup of bold white men, and just be like, no, that's not for me. And that's their loss. So, I think, that practices really need to make a good, decent effort to do their bit.
Yeah. And there's nothing wrong with old grey and white men, because I will be one day, so don't worry. We're just making an extreme point to kind of illustrate the problem and where we're going with the solution. Brilliant. So I've got the next one, which actually I think is going in the right direction. However, it's going in the right direction from quite a dire place. Now, I often, Julia, I think of architects like the fountain pen, that old film where the guy passes out after basically doing the model and staying up all night and saving the day. And there is that romantic notion in architecture of, we must do what it takes, because the architect knows best, or we have to save the day and so forth. But it's often at the cost of your own personal,
Yeah,
well-being.
definitely.
It's a price that adds up over time. What's your thoughts and observations on well-being?
I mean, yeah, I think you're right. Things are changing. There's definitely more practices that are prioritizing sensible working hours and really thinking about how they can stick to sensible working hours with, efficiency, limiting the amount of design options that they
Yeah.
go through, and, just knowing when a sort of creative process has come to a bit of a standstill. So there's obviously crossover on well-being with what we were talking about with studio environment and ways of working. It's basically making sure you're getting your work and home life balance right, and you're being looked after so that you're not going to sort of burn out or take on too much. I think, as you say, architecture is often seen as this sort of slightly vocational job that you'll just give everything to it. And I think not just in the architecture industry, but across lots of industries, people are just like, that's just not a way that people can work for very long.
Yeah.
And I think particularly young people coming through now are just not prepared to do it good. And I think employers need to learn that people do want a better balance. They don't want to be there late at night unpaid. That's no longer acceptable. So I think looking at how they support individuals in terms of sensible working hours, policies, and also a process of how to get support if you need it. There's often within management sort of certain people that you can talk to who aren't your immediate boss, that if you feel something's not right, you have another avenue. Obviously,
Yeah.
in very small companies that sort of might be slightly more problematic. But yeah, I would really be looking at sort of care of your physical and mental well-being in a studio.
Yeah, well said. And I agree that actually, and now as I'm experiencing as an employee, really the buck stops. Oh, my brain's gone. The buck stops short. I think that was the right saying. With the company owner, we have to be
Yeah,
responsible for our employees' well-being. That being said, I'll just make one note that if anyone in the audience is particularly struggling with their well-being, it's a really good resource. The Architects Benevolent Society, if you work in the industry, you can contact them and they have a really good help support line, and they'll just really help you out with that. If you are, unfortunately, in an environment which perhaps isn't looking after well-being. Sometimes, though, even the best companies, what I think is if you've got a particularly difficult project or something, unfortunately, some people kind of slip between the cracks. And I think that goes back to what you were saying earlier, Julia, where, internal communication. And sometimes you do have to have those uncomfortable conversations like, I'm feeling a bit burnt out at the moment.
yeah.
And hopefully that will be received in a way that isn't, like the Gordon Ramsay word we were talking about of what you absolute donkey donut. Why are you.
Exactly. Yeah, we hear all these reports of like bullying and toxicity and long hours, and like that's not okay, and you need to be on the lookout for it. Yeah, so I think that it's a really, really important aspect.
Nice. Now the next one in the list, when I saw it, I was like, that makes sense. Very I'm very interested to hear your thoughts on this. I've got a few ideas on it, but how does one stay inspired? We touched upon just now difficult deadlines and stuff, and that can be a bit of a Debbie Downer because you're like, oh, knackered and all that stuff. But even in the good times, the importance of keeping people inspired. What's
Yeah.
your experience on that?
I mean, I think so. You've obviously got your career progression, but staying inspired generally about, this industry that we're in. Does your company invest in research and innovation? So this is outside of projects, but in working hours, importantly. And usually research should be based around sort of something to do with their purpose or a kind of industry cause or issue that they're trying to address. So, if actually research is important to you, are they a practice that invests in research? A lot do, but also, many don't. So that's something
Yeah.
to look out for. There was also a great post thinking about CPD content and being interesting and, you know, keeping up to speed with things. Chris Simmons, who I'm not sure if he's able to make the call today, but I'm sure he'll be listening later.
Oh.
He did a great post, was it this week, saying that, you know, CPDs are not just for sandwiches, which did make me chuckle, but he was saying, you know, that really this is like a really important part of your journey, whatever stage you're at. It shouldn't just be a sales pitch by suppliers. It should be keeping you up to speed with evolving standards, new materials, innovative technologies, you know, and so it should really be something that keeps you inspired. And, you know, a practice who's just getting kind of ironmongery manufacturers coming in every week, or, you know, tile suppliers, not that those things aren't also part of the mix, but, you know, I would be saying, come on, this really isn't, we literally are just here for the sandwiches. So I think, thinking, you know, what does inspire you, and am I learning? And I think also learning based on practice experience. So do you have internal forums based around sharing skills and experiences? You know, when you finish a project, there will always be lessons learned, good and bad, you know, mistakes made, but actually also innovative things that you did that could be rolled out in the next project. That just makes good business sense. But it's also very interesting because it's a real live problem or solution. And, you know, that's a really good learning process. And it's a, you know, building that you could probably visit. And that was my final point here, is actually taking your staff out of the office to your own sites, to your own finished buildings, but also to other people's, you know, and perhaps even contacting. I used to do this in a practice, is actually contact other studios and say, can you just show us around this recently completed building? And more often than not, they were more than happy to, because they were really proud of it. Are there any exhibitions going on, you know, at the building centre or the Barbican or NLA that you could go to? It could even be a kind of 4:30 trip out of the office, but, you know, people can still be home by 6 if they want, you know, but they can also stay on and have a drink if they want to. So those kind of things, just to keep you inspired, you know, within the industry.
I just want to go slightly back to the CPD thing, because I saw Chris's post, and little quick interlude. Chris is like the nicest guy, and I know his content is starting to pop off, and, you know, but really amazing, cool stuff. Yeah, Chris said CPD is not just for the sandwiches. Well, I was the naughty boy that went for the sandwiches. But I agree with you, though. There was one CPD I went to, and it was really interesting. It talked about the offices of the future, and you had to kind of pick which way you think it was going to go. It was really interactive, and I paid attention for the whole thing, and it was really cool. And you're right, like the next week was just some ceramic tiles, and I was like dying in the background. But they had Pret sandwiches. So I was like, oh gosh, I know that manufacturer has them. But you're right. I think the CPD is a space for innovation. I've got a few ideas in the future, you know, of what could disrupt that. But you're right. I think that could be a really nice source of, you know, inspiration. The only last thing I would say on that, which I've seen a really cool example of it, is like internal competitions. Okay, maybe it's not a building that's going to get built, but how cool is that? Suddenly people come to life. The part one comes out of nowhere with the best project ever, and you're like, what the heck? Where's that guy come from? He's amazing.
Definitely. And me as the comms team, you know, when I've seen projects like that, I mean, there was once, I think we practice did it was like a flamingo hide or something, or flamingo sort of enclosure, somewhere sort of Middle East or something. And I was just, I had no idea this had gone on. It was a totally kind of random competition, and we didn't get shortlisted, but we should share that kind of thing anyway. And we did, and it went down really well. So it's just sort of, you know, showing people what's going on just helps everybody stay inspired.
Amazing. We've got a comment come in from an anonymous LinkedIn. I think because you've got to tick the allow button. But Mr. or Mrs. Anonymous says, hi, Steve. Reba Core 20 CBDs are fab, but sort of pricey. Employers, pay for the Reba Core 20 and RBA. Come on, let's get a coupon code. You know, we gotta be, where's the point? We've got to be inclusive, right? We don't want to price people out of all the good stuff. Come on, RBA. Okay, we'll put it on your list when you get there. Okay, I digress, and I'll go back to the track, because we're nearing the end of your amazing list. Social.
We're almost
Okay.
there, yeah. Now, this is like the social life of the practice. And I know it's more or less important to certain practices, but for me, the social life, it can be in working hours and it can be out of working hours. But again, you need to think about your team and, what do you want out of a social life? I think that if you're a student and you've just moved to a city or you've just started in a practice, a recent graduate, then obviously your social life is maybe going to be more important because you want to create friendships and maybe meet other people from other parts of the company, different departments. But, as other commitments kind of come into play and perhaps these sort of pile on in later life, then you might find the social aspect is sort of less important to you. So you're sort of thinking about, other responsibilities, other commitments, other passions that you have. And I would really be thinking about the social life of a practice. How optional is it? Because there are definitely practices that kind of, if you're not on board with the social life, which can be quite demanding, you're not actually going to sort of progress through that company because it's that important to run the company. And I'm quite anti that, because I think that, you shouldn't have to give up, spare time. And I'm certainly like not an antisocial person. I've always enjoyed the social life of an office, but I don't think it should be a part of your career progression necessarily. So yeah, I think it's just how much of a social life is there? How invested do you want to be in it? How important is it to your experience at that studio?
Very interesting. I agree. Like, I really think social life. And now I'm getting a bit older. It's still important. I think when I came to London, the first architecture practice I went EPR, they had a really good social life, and they got the balance right, Julia, like you said, where if you were not really going out on the Fridays and stuff, you weren't really missing out. It was optional. It wouldn't go against you. But it was also a really good way to make friends, and we're not on about like you have to get absolutely mullered or anything. You could go out for one drink or anything, but they put a lot of events on. They do the life drawing now and the yoga. So there was something for everything. If you wanted that cheeky beer, it's there. If you wanted to do the life drawing, it's there. And I thought they got the balance right, because if you didn't go, you didn't feel the peer pressure. And I don't know about you, but I've had that friend before who would always, when I was younger, try to ring me up to go out. And in the end, it just absolutely drove me mad. But then you would get the fear of missing out thing. So you weren't enjoying it if you don't go. It was like peer pressure,
It definitely can feel like that. So I think, as an employer, thinking about, does our offering, is it inclusive for people who don't drink? Or for people who don't want to kind of do the full like sort of stag or hen party kind of experience, when they're going out. So yeah, I think just that thinking about what you want to get out of it.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, for instance, with me, I eat meat, but my new plate is a vegan, right? And it's totally cool. And now it's just like something it's taken me a little bit, but now I think about it constantly. But it's stuff like that, isn't it? Where if it's all beers, well, maybe I don't like a beer, so people have to think about being inclusive, but these all kind of feed into each other.
They do.
Now, the last one.
Yeah.
I don't know how you're going to this is a big one. This is as big as social. Community.
Community. Yeah. And this is a big one for me, and certainly I've done a lot of work in this area and really, really enjoyed it. But for me, when I sort of put community as the heading, I mean, as a practice, as an employer, being a good neighbour, having a positive impact locally. So thinking about local engagement. So we all know that the architecture industry can be quite difficult to access, or even difficult to know that it exists and what the routes into it are. So making yourselves and your organization accessible locally. Can you do a careers talk at a local school? Can you do sort of workshops or activities, or invite schools to do tours of your studio? Can you offer work experience, not just to your client's nephew, but actually to make sure that there's a commitment to 50% local, 75% local, And also, can you share skills with local organizations? And certainly I've seen this happen before where, an architect can work with a community organization who's trying to sort of get funding for redevelopment of their building or an extension, and actually just a few hours of your time to sketch out what could be possible can literally be the unlocking to them getting funding from, a grant or the borough, and it'll unlock the whole process. So I think there are lots of ways that architects can make a positive impact locally, and should, as should every industry. But I think, architects almost have such a useful set of skills, and quite a sort of, barrier to accessibility that, there's a lot of ways you can be a good neighbour.
Very well said. And also, the bit that I would like to add to community as well is also with other architecture practices. So, I think there's softball, but also there's a few other things where there's like a few events like the Young Architects Developers Alliance, and that's a bunch of architects mixing, but getting involved, getting in the community, mixing with other practices. There's a chicken run in the ABS with all architecture practices. They raise money for charity and then celebrate after. But also, that cross collaboration I think can be enriching in as well, rather than this silo thing where you only are with your own company. I think that's an old way of something. It's like, oh, they're the competition. Whereas
exactly,
whereas like now I'm in a WeWork, it's quite funny because even in recruitment, there's this, when it's like sales, and maybe you'll know as well, when you're competing for bids, you're like, oh, heaven forbid, I talk about this and certain things, and okay, I know there's confidential aspects of projects, but when you're in these environments and everyone's co-working, I realized quite quickly people, they care about their business. They're not, it's fine. And when architects meet up with each other, they're not out there to gouge information. Usually they were, it's like, and it's sometimes nice to meet people in the profession at different places,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I think that's another sort of side of it, isn't it? That kind of industry community. And you're seeing it more and more with younger practices who are collaborating together, pitching together, things like the London Practice Forum, which is a sort of group of smaller architects that kind of group together to share knowledge and skills. They even share staff. So, if one sort of project goes on hold, they move stuff across and then they come back. It's, it's a really great idea because there's so much. If all of those practices went away to research kind of, insurance or whatever, then that's sort of so many people spending time doing the same thing. Whereas if they kind of pool those resources, then it makes so much sense. There's so much valuable knowledge that can be shared between other people within the same industry.
Very cool. I've heard of one or two elusive groups in the industry of like a HR and architecture. And
there is one.
Yeah, and there's a financial directors one there as well. So there's a few.
There's a couple of comms ones as well. In fact, one of them run by IO, and they're brilliant. And actually, when I set up as a consultant, I was, I kind of was so surprised at how many of my so-called competitors actually reached out to me in a really friendly and lovely way. And we ask each other for advice, we share contacts, we kind of it's a really supportive landscape, and I think that's the way it should be.
Very cool. And look, I mean, we've covered your 10 amazing points where you offered insight. So I'm going to do a round of applause. I was just noticing because I got this new big cup. It's like if you were wearing 3D glasses, it looks like I'm coming out of the screen. So sorry, the audience, for like jabbing you in the face, but it keeps me hydrated throughout the show. So I'm gonna talk about your consultancy in a second. But just before that, Julie, I always like to give the opportunity for people to ask me questions. Now, as such a diligent character, I reckon you already knew I was going to do that, and you might have one or two questions for me before we wind down.
So for me or the audience?
You can ask me. Yeah. Don't worry about the audience. Well, sorry, the audience. Oh, they all got to leave now. You can ask a question, but Julie, you can ask me a question as well.
I mean, well, firstly, is there anything that you think I have missed off the list in terms of culture? Would there be anything you would be looking for?
Good question. I mean,
Or which one would be most important to you if you were giving up the architecture social, looking for a job, never gonna? Which one's most important?
Crikey, controversial one. Discussing salary, I think, would be an important one. You know,
Yeah.
it's not all about the salary. It is, though, important because especially now things are quite tough. And I think it shouldn't be all about the salary, but I think we have to start normalizing the conversations of salaries because I
Yeah.
used to remember, Julia, being so worried about bringing it up that I often wouldn't. And then it would kind of come at the end and then I would worry about it. Whereas actually, being professionals, it's actually okay to talk about salaries. And I think one of the baptisms of fire of learning this the hard way, as you know now, is being your own consultant because really the buck stops with you. And if you don't bring up money at the front, sometimes you can waste time down the process. And I think that it's okay to talk about it when you're talking about the full position. You should be interested in the projects. You should be interested in a lot of stuff that we talked about here. What is the studio culture? You should gloss like inclusivity. You can challenge, you know, maybe in an interview when they ask, do you have any questions? It's always good to talk about, you know, well-being, you know, what kind of projects, what examples of career progression, opportunities do you have here? But it's also okay if it's not popped up to talk about salary. I think it
For
should be
sure.
normalized and encouraged in a non-confrontational way. You know, what were
Yeah,
you looking to
sure.
pay someone?
And I
What
think that people like the Future Architects Fund are, you know, making a real point of that, you know, the salary should be upfront on the job advert. People should know, you know, what the kind of parameters of the salary are before they have to take the time to apply and perhaps go for an interview. And yeah, I think it probably comes back to transparency as well, doesn't it? And in terms of,
yes.
you know, are we on the same page in terms of money? It's important.
Yeah, and just to add to that as well, because I think where I sympathize with architectural practices is it's quite scary to put a number out there, but in my experience, it's never really a fixed number unless you're in the government, and it's always based on the individual and their experience and timing and so forth. And I'd encourage practices to be open with the fluidity of it, but
Yeah.
also the thing I'd throw back is that sometimes maybe too narrow a salary can exclude people that actually you'd pay extra for their skill set. And equally, you know, sometimes maybe hiring someone a bit earlier in their career who could be not qualified and therefore they're on a bit lower salary doesn't mean that you need to hire someone on this end to do the job. It can be someone with a lot of potential. And the
Yeah.
last thing I'd add to it is like software skills. I mean, they are important on one end of the scale, but at the other end of the scale, we should be open to training people. And I think that
Yeah.
sometimes in recruitment, they can cling to the word Revit. Oh, they don't have Revit. Oh, I'm not sure. But most people, if they're hungry and keen and eager, they will learn that stuff if you give them training, you know?
Definitely, yeah. And I think a decent employer will be totally open to training you. You know, it's just no one has all the assets. You know, no one sort of holds all the cards at one point. So I think if someone's 90% right, but they need some training in this aspect, then an employer would be stupid not to do that.
I agree. Before I show you your website, was there anything else you wanted to pick my brains on, Julia?
So much stuff. I've just noticed a question here. Should we look at that? Because I'm
Oh,
aware we're
okay.
nearly an hour.
Oh, yeah, go on then.
Does it harm my chances of getting into a more boutique design studio when my only experience has been in big corporate firms? I would say no. And actually, I've almost done the same, where I've gone from being a sort of communications director in a big studio for the largest portion of my career, and actually now working for very small firms. You've got to frame yourself right. So you've got to look at how your experience in the big corporate firms are going to apply to a boutique design studio. So I think it's, you know, you'll have a lot of skills that actually the boutique design studio could benefit from.
Yeah.
So I think it's just really having, communications for me is all about putting myself in the receiver's shoes. What would they like to hear about? What are the kind of contacts and experience that you have that's going to be really valuable to them?
Yeah, well said. And the only thing I would add to that is kind of embrace it. I always found, like, for instance, if you need sponsorship or visas, it's like the salary thing. Sometimes because it's an awkward situation, we can bring it up at the end. But why not go into that interview or send the application going, I've worked in a large practice. I've learned all this amazing stuff. I'm very interested in a smaller studio for XYZ. And I think you get that bit out at the start and people go, oh, okay, this is interesting. And I think then you kind of set the scene. So that would be my advice on going from big to small or small to big, Ooh, awesome. That's awesome advice. Thank you.
Oh, I'm pleased.
Well, you're welcome. Well, Julia, I'm going to give you a quick round of applause and bring up your website. So everyone in the audience, Julia, tell us about what you do in your business again at the moment.
So I do communications consultancy. Oh, look, there's my website. So it's basically around working with practices to understand their audiences and understand, how to connect better with their audiences, which does include future employees as well as clients and collaborators, and then create a really bespoke approach to sort of rolling out those communications in the right way. So, architects traditionally have often sort of communicated peer to peer, trying to impress each other rather than actually thinking about who is commissioning us and, who do we want to work with and alongside. So, I work with practices for sort of 2 or 3 months and then sort of give them a framework of advice on how I think they can best communicate with their target audiences.
Amazing. Well, I mean, if you ever were in doubt of should I or should I not speak to Julia, well, listen to this podcast because it was curated by her. And on that note, I'm going to give you another round of applause. Julia, I'm going to end now this live stream in a second. You've been an absolute star. And it's true. But for our audio listeners, if you want to check out Julia's consultancy, it's www.Julia Nicholls, Julia Nicholls, Nichols. Don't forget the other L at the end. That's what caught me out before.
Very important.
Yeah, I sent it to the wrong one and then worked it out quickly. It's like, damn it. So get that right. Check out Julia's website and get in contact. Julia, can people also find you on LinkedIn as well?
Yes, I'm on LinkedIn and I'm on Instagram.
Amazing. Well, you've been an absolute star. One more clap for good measures. And, you've had that cheeky shot at the start. Have another one now after this. I'm going to end the live stream. And for you guys in the audience, thank you so much for being here. If you've got any suggestions for more content in 2023, I'm all yours. And if you, like I said, if you want to find me, I am in Waterloo knocking around, trying to get the computers, trying to get my HR procedures, trying to be inclusive and trying to get a good environment as well. But until then, I will see you shortly for more content. Thank you again, Julia. I'm going to end the broadcast now. Take care, everyone. Stay on the stage, Julia.